It's with great pleasure today that we welcome Dr Margaret Spencer to be our speaker at this, our 50th AGM of STAR Victoria. And Dr Margaret Spencer, and you can see her picture down here on the screen if you look down. Margaret, would you like to wave? So, yeah, there's Margaret down there for people who would like to, okay. Dr Margaret Spencer is a lecturer and Director of Field Education in the Social Work Program at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Sydney. She's got a very diverse background and holds qualifications in nursing, theology, and social work. Margaret's doctorate and ongoing research focus is on women with disability and reproductive justice. She's currently the Executive Secretary on the International Association for the Scientific Study of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, Special Interest Research Group, Parenting with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. Margaret is also currently a serving member on the board of the Intellectual Disability Rights Service. For the past 35 years, Margaret's been involved with parents with intellectual disability and their children. Her involvement has been as a support worker, foster carer, advocate, and researcher. The role she has valued and maybe learned the most, particularly about herself and family, has been as the mother behind the mother with an intellectual disability. In this presentation, she'll explain the concept and key role of the mother behind the mother and the need for this to be recognised and at times created and supported. And Margaret, it is really with great warmth we welcome you today to our AGM to bring up your presentation on being the mother behind a mother with intellectual disability. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you. Well, I feel very privileged. I actually didn't know this was your 50th, that this is your 50th AGM. So I feel quite honoured that I've been chosen as the person to give the keynote today. And it's quite interesting that 50 years on that you've chosen someone like myself to talk about the topic of parenting with intellectual disability. I'm sure back in 1970 when STAR was founded, the issue of parenting with disability was not something that was necessarily on STAR's agenda. So it says something about where we've come in 50 years and about in terms of the rights of people with disabilities. In preparing this keynote, I've somewhat tweaked the topic. I'm going to still talk about the mother behind the mother, but I've called it Giving Voice because I thought that was appropriate for the organisation to families where a parent has intellectual disability. And I use the term family in terms of not necessarily biological family, but intentional families, which is the family that I'll talk about when I talk about my own. I also would like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I acknowledge the land from which I'm present today, and that's here at the University of Sydney on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded and is and always will be Gadigal land. I'm actually going to start this presentation saying somewhat cheekily, I think, what are we doing wrong? So often when it comes to people with disabilities, people always talk about what the person with disabilities is always doing wrong, particularly intellectual disability. I think it's much more appropriate that we look at ourselves to say, what are we doing wrong? So I'm just going to talk quite broadly about parenting with intellectual disability for the moment. What we know is that there's probably there's about 1% of the parenting population in Australia has an intellectual disability. And when I talk about intellectual disability, as you know, I'm sure everyone in this audience knows, we're talking about a great range of people it's a broad term. Many of the people who we talk about as parents with intellectual disabilities are what I would often call the successors of normalisation. They're people who, for all intensive purposes, have been labelled as having an intellectual disability, usually during their schooling. And they don't necessarily identify with that label as adults. They see themselves as filling many different roles, whether it be a worker to a sister, to an auntie, to a friend, a neighbour, and also for some, they aspire to be and do become mothers and fathers. We know that the estimated population of parents with intellectual disability in Australia is somewhere around 1%. So you're really sort of saying, this is not a big group. However, when you look at it in terms of that group of parents, in terms of child protection, they they're overrepresented in child protection. 1 in 10 cases that are in your children's court will have a parent or parents with intellectual disability, and oftentimes other issues that come with having an intellectual disability, such as trauma from upbringing, mental health issues, poor physical health, and certainly issues of poverty, and sadly, also often experiences of intimate partner violence. So we know that this group is a particularly vulnerable group, and their children also are particularly vulnerable to being removed and growing up in out of home care. So it's a significant issue in the child protection space, and one that I've spent a lot of my since 1985 advocating in different roles to bring to the attention of policymakers and to try and improve practice in the area. So when I talk about what are we doing wrong, I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of because why that high representation? We must be doing something wrong if 1 in 10 families that are in the children's court, the issue is that the parent has an intellectual disability. You might think on the surface, you might be going, well, that's because they can't look after their children. We know that with the right support, in the right context, many parents with intellectual disabilities, particularly those, as we say, in that mild borderline range, which are the parents that we're talking about, are able to parent and are really great parents. But the expectations that we put on them, the benchmarks that we set for them are often unrealistic, and we set them up to fail. And I welcome Susan Arthurs to the AGM today, and who is a parent with disability who has been a strong champion in this area, and it certainly has taught me a lot. So it's nice to see you here today, Susan. So just in terms of what are we doing wrong? Okay, one of the first things that we do wrong is that we hold entrenched assumptions. The idea that a person with a disability can't be a parent is really stuck in our heads. It's really stuck in the community psyche, and it goes right back to the good old days where it was about having to sterilise people with disabilities because the fear of them having children like themselves. So that was sort of there's been this entrenched assumption that has been there for a long time. There's these assumptions that they won't be able to do it, that they won't be able to be be taught, that they'll be taken advantage of by others. Yes, as I said, often they are taken advantage of by others, but is that because of them or because of how society is set up? That they won't sort of understand the importance of parenting. In my 35 years, all the people that I have worked with have understood the importance of it. They haven't entered it as a game. It's something that they've really aspired to. And that they will be a liability to their offspring is something that is often said, and that they'll pass on their disability. Well, that's not the case. We know that many disabilities are not inherited. Oftentimes when offsprings do have a disability and their parent has a disability, it can be because they too are experiencing the same social disadvantage and deprivation that their parents suffered as a child. So it's more about entrenched poverty than anything else. and that it won't be fair on the children. And by the end of this, I think that you'll see that for children who grow up in a loving family with a parent or parents with intellectual disabilities with the right support, they don't see their parents as a liability. They don't see it as unfair. They see them as mum and dad and people that they love. The question that their children will outgrow them, well, once again, as we get further down the track, I'll talk about, I think, my granddaughters, who are the daughters of my daughter with an intellectual disability. Last night when I had them in the car to go to sport, I was texting and they, in frustration, grabbed the phone off me to tell me that I wasn't doing it right and that I was too slow. And so they've outgrown me in technology. And so, we all outgrow our parents in particular areas. I don't think we outgrow our parents necessarily in respect or should ever outgrow our parents in respect and love. The issue of being incapable of learning, which is another assumption, is not held up. We have now 70 years of research which says that IQ is not a predictor of good enough parenting. The other problem that we have is, one of the bigger problems is that we don't prepare persons with cognitive difficulties or intellectual disability for parenting. So, they're often not, they're often protected, shielded from understanding about relationships, understanding about how to pick a good relationship, about things like family planning and being given choice and control over that. So I think that, one of the problems is that by not saying, well, we don't want to go down that path, we don't want to think about them becoming parents, is in avoiding the topic, we can often create problems. I think the other thing that is a big problem is that we overestimate the specialness of parenting with cognitive difficulties. These parents, have the same needs as other parents. And like other parents, if they are put under too much stress, if they're not given the resources that they need, if they're isolated and don't have the support, they're going to be finding it difficult. So I think, that the specialness, that we overestimate that and use that as an excuse for not supporting parents with intellectual disabilities or cognitive difficulties the way that we should. I think another big problem is that our systems don't talk to each other. And I know as an advocacy service and as people with lived experience of disability, this, I don't need to tell you this, that our services don't talk to each other, and that is really problematic. And as well as not talking to each other, we have services that pass the buck. Well, I'm not responsible for the parent, I'm responsible for the children. Our interest is the child, not the parents. And so this buck passing that happens instead of looking at the family as a whole. Another big problem, I think, that I've seen over the time is that we scare parents. So the parents that I've worked with, oftentimes they are very scared when they become a parent. They often are told that, given warnings that they won't be able to do it, that they will pick up on the annoyance of people around them who think that they've made a wrong move, that they'll be told that if they don't do things a particular way, that they're going to have their children removed. And when we scare anyone, if we get scared, what do? We tend to retreat. And so oftentimes we retreat, and oftentimes we make bad choices. And I think, we can often set parents up to fail by scaring them. I think we also try to normalise them as a family. We try to sort of go, okay, we're going to come in and we're going to fix you up and make you look like, any other family. Every family is different. And I think that we have to understand that family life can take many different forms. And so I think that oftentimes what we do is we try to normalise families where parents have an intellectual disability, rather than actually going, your parenting is going to look different in this context, and that's okay. I like this cartoon, which is one you can see the dentist trying to put a tennis ball into this poor man's mouth. And it says, now open even wider, Mr. Stevens, just out of curiosity, we're going to see if we can cram in this tennis ball. And oftentimes what I found when working and supporting parents with intellectual disabilities, when we do go to support them, we try and put in all of these services. We put in everything that we can get. And what we do is we just set people up to fail, because we rather than looking at what is needed, we put so much in. And often what we're putting in is not because we think that is actually going to be supportive, but it's really to protect our own skin as service providers, that that there's enough monitoring and supervision of this family so that nothing can go wrong, and and that sets people up to fail. We often decide on the things that are a priority for the parents and for their children as workers, and that's not often a priority, or it may not make sense for the parents. So often they're being asked to do things, to live places, to go to courses, to do things that don't make sense to them or are not their priority. And for all of us, when something's not our priority and not our sense, we tend to disengage with what's happening. We we also confuse these parents with mixed messages, so they get lots of mixed messages. And for people with lived experience of intellectual disability, and really for all of us, when we get mixed messages, it just becomes too confusing, and it's really hard to know who to trust and who to listen to. And gets back to, we often focus on the parent, usually the mother, but we are slow often to provide the basics. So poor housing, lack of income, those types of things are often the things that put the family under stress and put the parent under stress. And so in failing to provide those types of basics, we often set parents up to fail. This one speaks for itself. I think the thing is that when parents, all parents, anyone who's parent knows that they slip up. I'm sure that if we opened the conversation up to talk about the slip-ups as parents that everyone has made, we'd have some very interesting stories to be told. But the problem is when parents with intellectual disabilities slip up, that's seen as and read as inevitable failure. And we also set as the benchmark when we're looking at parenting with intellectual disability, we say, well, what we need to see is we need to see that this parent can do this on their own and parents autonomously. And the reality is nobody parents autonomously. A child is parented by many people, and many people are involved in that. So I think that also is an unfair expectation. And when we see the children, and I can see a typo in here, so sorry about that. When we see the children, we often see them as victims of the parents. So, this poor child with these parents. The children don't see themselves as victims. As I said, for children who are in a secure relationship with their parent, whether their parent has a disability or not, see their parent as their parent and someone that they love. So when we see children as victims, we tend to want to rescue them. And then when we do rescue them, we tend to sideline and we don't support their parents. And that then leads to a cycle of a whole lot of other problems. Oftentimes, the parent having other children and those children going into care, or the parent own mental health and well-being suffering even more. What could we do right to enable justice? Well, as I said, there's lots of research now, and there's been a lot of things done in terms of practice that says, we don't have to keep on having 1 in 10 families in our child protection system being a parent with an intellectual disability. We don't need that. We can actually do something to improve this situation. And one of the things that we need to do is, first of all, we need to start way back about improving the lives for people with intellectual disabilities way back as children. And this, I don't need to tell you really about this. It's really about, we need to be thinking about the pathway to parenthood from a very early age. We need to be talking about that, not as, you have to become a parent, because there's a lot of people with intellectual disabilities who can't be and won't be and actually don't want to be parents. But for those who do, then they need to be provided with the education and the insight and the reality of what parenting involves, and to be able to be best placed to take on parenting when it comes to them. And I think that the other thing that we need to do is we need to respectfully engage with people with intellectual disabilities, but particularly with parents with intellectual disabilities. We need to have attitudinal change. We need to address those assumptions that we have. We need to make it safe for people with learning difficulties, cognitive disabilities, intellectual disabilities, whatever name we're going to use, to feel it's okay to seek out support. We've got to stop scaring them. We have to enable parents with intellectual disabilities to get the relevant supports at the appropriate times, and not to feel bad about doing that they actually see that they have a right to that support. And we need to work with parents as partners. We need to be listening to what they see as a priority and working with them, and not working for them or deciding what is best for them, and moreover what's best for their children. And we need to see parenting not as something that you have to have right at the beginning, but see parenting as developmental. And that means giving parents a chance, that they have to learn from mistakes. They have to, within safe bounds for the children, of course, but they need to be able to. We need to see parenting as developmental, and sort of build on the successes. And we need to address those contextual issues like poor housing, lack of money, domestic violence, those types of things. We need to address those. If we can address those, we'll see less parents and children coming into the child protection system. The other thing that we need to do is, as I said, we need to make supports accessible. As I said, the type of education or the type of parenting, in terms of learning about parenting, what we know is really about parent education. Good parent education should be inclusive parenting education. So, we need to think about not having separate programs as we have with schooling, when we've gone, we need to have this separate program because these kids have intellectual disabilities. For some, yes, there are some programs that are necessary, but in terms of parenting, we need to say, how do we make our parenting programs inclusive of all parents? So how do we do that? So start to think in terms of inclusive education principles when it comes to parenting education. And we need to also make disability competence a graduate attribute. So in terms of people coming through our TAFE programs, through our universities, it's important that our nurses, our doctors, our social workers, our teachers all understand about disability, and therefore when they're in situations, know how to respond in an appropriate way. Okay, I think the other really important thing is, to raise a child, it takes a village. And this will come out in the story that I'm going to tell you in a short while, is that to raise a child, a parent can't be expected to do it on their own, and we need to think about how do we put parents with intellectual disabilities into conducive environments, into villages that are supportive. And when we do go to look at their capacity to parent, what we need to think about is not just them as a person, their intellectual disability, and focusing on that, but we need to think about the context. As I've written here, capacity is a state, it's not an inherent trait. Our capacity to do anything depends on our environment, what we're being asked to do, and is also dependent on the time in which we're being asked to do it. So we need to start thinking differently about how we assess parenting. Rather than thinking about parenting capacity, I think we need to start to think about parenting similar to how we're thinking about it in terms of supported decision making. How do we think about supported parenting? And what should that look like? And here I talk about, as I said, I don't think there's anything such as autonomous parenting, but I think that what we can think about is, does parenting, the rearing of this child, need to be something that just happens within the family unit, autonomously? Does it need to be assisted? Does it need to have ongoing support? Is it something that is a shared arrangement? And then, really the last thing we should be looking at is substituting the parent altogether. And when a parent is under question, to be fairly treated, and that's where, the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities come in, and really the need for, sort of advocacy services like your own, to really be there to make sure that when parenting is under question, that parents are afforded a justice. I think access to justice is really important. Before my being here at the university, I set up at Intellectual Disability Rights Service a program where we provided advocacy to parents in the child protection system. And, some of the things that came out of that was just parents reporting how powerless they felt, bewildered by the process, not heard, made to feel um, um, made to feel incompetent, that should say, and reinforcing their sense of being devalued because of their intellectual disability. Oftentimes being blamed for what's happening when they're really the victims of what's causing the problems, which is domestic violence, or, sort of being traumatized and unsupported. So it's really important that, that the role of advocacy in this space, and that we get that right. And when parents aren't able to have their children at home with them, and that their child may need to go into an alternative form of support, that we enable justice for those parents, and that we actually still recognise that they are still parents to that child, and that they need the support to continue in that shared role while their children are in the care of someone else. So they should never be excluded from that. And and so some points here, and this is some of the things that that we need to look at in terms of, particularly in that area where parents with intellectual disabilities have their children in care, that we're actually not just forgetting about them. Often what happens when children are removed from parents with intellectual disability, people sort of go, okay, well, the parent is no longer our issue, and they focus on the child, but there's a whole lot of things happening for that parent that need to be looked at, and that's particularly around the loss and grief, the impact of that on their well-being, and the impact on that for their children who are in care. So a parent's poor adjustment to life post-removal has been shown to have a detrimental impact on their children. And, to do what we need to be doing is we need to be looking at breaking the cycle, because what we know is that the study by Broadhurst says that 60% of mothers involved in care proceedings were back in the court within 1 year for care proceedings involving a newborn child. So we need to sort of look at this rapid repeat pregnancy, and we need to sort of look at that as a maladaptive or a grief process, often, or that fact that the mother is still in a very abusive situation and doesn't have control over her own reproductive rights, and we need to work with to support particularly those mothers in order to break the cycle. Okay, now I've talked a lot there that for many listening might go, that's all sort of very interesting, but sort of how about in real life? What is this like in real life? Well, as I said, much of what I've learned, even though I've worked in this area for a long time, I've done my PhD in this area, it's my area of research. Probably the people who have taught me the most about this are the people who are on the screen here at the moment. The family behind the family. Or I say I'm the mother behind the mother here. Amanda's wearing the Sydney University sweatshirt there, and that is taken just prior to Amanda and I going overseas last year to present at the IACID conference in Glasgow, the World Conference on Intellectual Disability, where we presented on our shared parenting arrangement, and over the last year it was 15 years, we're up to 16 years now. And the two children in there is on next to me is Beth, and next to Amanda is Lily, and they're twins. They're identical twins. Amanda is the little blonde-headed girl in the picture here, and Amanda's relationship to me is I'm her godmother. To explain how I became Amanda's godmother at the age of 5. Amanda was living with her mother, who had an intellectual disability and whose life had been marred by abuse and neglect, and a childhood of growing up in institutional care. And I was the family's family support worker. And just while the little one at the bottom, Katrina, just before she was born, I became involved with the family. And the family had many needs. And around the time that Amanda's sister, a year younger, with the little impish character there on the side, was to go to school, the nearest school to where the family lived was a local Catholic school. And her mother wanted to go to that school and wanted to have the kids baptised. I often say it was a baptism of convenience, but with no one else available, I was asked to step in as Amanda's godmother. And so Amanda still refers to me as her godmother. She's always said that I'm her godmother. And in taking on that role, at the time, I didn't realise what that role would mean, but it's meant over the last 32 years of being another mother to Amanda. Amanda ended up, and her sisters ended up needing to come into care overnight, or coming into care one night after an incident in the family home. And the way that it worked out, they ended up coming back to me for one night and ended up staying for much longer. Foster care, they did go into their, what often is referred to, which I hate the term, forever family, and that didn't work out. And it didn't work out because people basically didn't accept that the girls had intellectual disabilities, and they and so foster care after foster care had this idea that it was just because of neglect that they were like they were, and didn't accept their disability, and then when it became all too hard, gave them up. And so these kids were sort of going through this revolving door of foster care. Amanda and her sister to the side ended up having around 13 placements over the course of their time in foster care. They spent a lot of time with me in between the revolving door. I was their respite carer after providing, so I was always there for them and was the one constant in their life. When they aged out of care, by the time they aged out of care, Amanda's last foster care placement were a young couple who had a child of their own at the time. And for Amanda, that's where she learnt a lot about becoming a mother, because she watched her foster carer become a mother. And for her, it was, she'd often say she learned how to be a mother by watching Nikki mother her baby. For her other sister, a year younger, it didn't work out as well for her. The baby coming into the foster care arrangement was a threat, and she self-restored to her birth family at that time. But for Amanda, being with the family and being around this baby for the first probably 9 months of his life gave her a good insight into what being a mother was about. Amanda had also been very maternal. As you can see, she's the eldest of this little family unit, and so she had maternal instincts even at this age of 5. And so anyhow, Amanda left school and sort of left foster care, and we set her up in her own place, and she had a job making doughs at the Pizza Hut, and lots of things were happening for her. But the one thing that we couldn't provide her with was the friendship network she wanted, and the other thing that she saw other girls her age doing, which was getting boyfriends. And that was something that was difficult to create for her. Unfortunately, her birth mother came back into her life at that point and promised her that she would get her a boyfriend. And Amanda was lured back into a very unstable situation. And before too long, she rings me and she says, I've got good news. I've got double good news. And to tell me that she was pregnant. I think at this point, I had been, this point probably I'd had about 15 years of being doing a lot of education around parenting with intellectual disability and giving a lot of doing a lot of work with workers talking about the rights of people with intellectual disabilities to be parents, and often talked about how when a person announces that that they're having a child, most people say, "Oh, this is fantastic news, congratulations." But when a parent with an intellectual disability says that they're having a child, often what they get is, "Why are you doing that for? You know that you shouldn't have done that. You can go through with an abortion. How are you going to look after this child?" And so what they face is people's immediate worry and concern. And so, I was very conscious of that. So when Amanda rang me and she said she had good news, double good news, I have to say, I was surprised by my reaction, and because I didn't see it as good news. She was living in a very unstable situation. I knew that the children were a result of exploitation, and and I was very worried, but I felt a real hill for that. Here am I as a champion of parents with intellectual disabilities, and I couldn't champion for my own daughter, my own goddaughter, at this point. That so for me, even though I was able to congratulate her, I did have worries, and I've sort of think back now. Was it because of her intellectual disability? It wasn't so much about her intellectual disabilities, but I knew that because of her situation, coupled with her intellectual disabilities, that, she wasn't on a pathway to parenting that was going to be easy. She eventually had these two little dots. She had them early, and at 35 weeks, and they came into the world, and she fell in love with them. And one needed to be in special care nursery for a while, and so that meant that she had longer in hospital, which meant that she also was going to be under the gaze of health professionals and child protection workers for a period of time. I didn't like the chances of her being able to bring these babies home. And just like through the pregnancy, I was there in the background, but it was really hard to be enthusiastic or to buy into the situation because I was really worried. So I really understand that from the parents of parents now. And anyhow, I went out to the hospital I and I saw Amanda with the babies. She was holding Lily with confidence and maternal love that she was looked very at ease. And she was standing over the humidity crib watching her other baby and speaking softly to her. And I saw just what being a parent, I saw her go from being a young adult with intellectual disability, and now I just saw her as a mother, and a mother who wanted to parent these kids. And so we did a lot of talking, and we had to talk a lot with child protection workers. And because of my status, because people knew who I was, because I had some power within the service system, I was able to advocate for Amanda, and she ended up being allowed to bring the babies home. And because she didn't have a home to go to, and we had to, once again, situation of having to wait for housing, she had to go to refuge accommodation for people who were escaping from domestic violence. And because there was nowhere in New South Wales for a parent with an intellectual disability to go to get the support that they needed. And so she had to spend nearly 16 months in emergency accommodation until she moved into her own home. So she was for a long time under a lot of scrutiny, and that was really difficult, and it made me aware of those structural issues that can bring a parent unstuck, and in I sort of often look back and think if only we could have had housing for her right up front. Um, but sort of what I realised very early in the piece was that for Amanda to mother her babies, she needed to be a mother. She needed to be mothered herself. She needed to have my love and nurturance. I remember going to visit her one day and going in and sort of um, you know you know going over the babies, and she says, "You love my babies. Do you love me?" And it was a really interesting statement that she made, because during the pregnancy it was sort of somewhat difficult. She had chosen to go her own path. And from then on, I always would go up and give Amanda a kiss and a cuddle before I talked to the kids. And even still now, I always talk to her first. I think that thing of the mother behind the mother, mothers need to be nurtured too. We just don't need to nurture their babies. They need to feel loved too. And Amanda needed to have that. She didn't have a partner who could love her and nurture her. So that was really important. I also saw that she needed someone who had her back because she was under a lot of scrutiny. So people were watching what she was doing. And so she needed someone to have her back. And so often, so what these two writers, they're very long names, I'm sorry about that, and they're very hard to pronounce, but it's Sigjong's daughter and Trustadottir. They're two people from Iceland who have written about the mother behind the mother and talking about the importance of that mother who's there to provide guidance, practical support, and sage advice at times when it's needed. And becoming the mother behind the mother is the role that I took on. And we started to share the care. Looking after twins is hard. Looking after twins on your own is hard. Looking after twins on your own when you don't have stable housing and when you are 21 is really difficult. So giving Amanda a break was really important. Amanda had always come, she and her sisters had always come to me for respite weekends. So the idea of having her children go to respite was a very normal thing. And because her experience of respite with me was a very good thing, she was happy for that to happen for her babies from a very young age. So the girls, we had a room set up for the girls, and they used to go between Amanda and my house. And so that's something that we did, that we negotiated. Amanda also found just the difficulties of managing her finances quite problematic. So very early in the piece, she asked that would I look after the family money, which I did, and we had a financial management order made, and Amanda was very happy with that. I became very much the go-between person, the go-to person when the kids were sick. I'd been that for Amanda as a child, so because she saw me as that I was a nurse. So when the kids were sick, she would contact me, and often I was the go-between people between child protection and housing and other people dealing with officials. So as sort of somewhat of an advocacy position. Amanda's did the day-to-day care. She was very good at keeping routines for the girls, and Amanda was also very good at building and managing a circle of support around her. She's a very social person, and she likes to have a chat with people, and so she endeared herself to people, and built up her circle of support. And that was sort of encouraged by me because I knew that I couldn't do it all on my own, and that she needed to have a family. She needed a mother behind her. She also needed a family behind her. And I'm one of 9 children, and my parents were alive at the time when the children were little, and they also very much saw Amanda as much their granddaughter as their other grandchildren. And so, she got that message that we were her family. She made a decision, probably a really important decision that she made at the time when the babies were little, very little, like 6 weeks old, that she was going to sever contact with her birth family. And I take it that had been an incident that put one of the children at risk on a weekend. And when I came in and saw bruising on the baby, I asked what had happened. She goes, my birth mother's not coming near my children ever again. And so Amanda's held that up. I know that's really hard on her birth mother, but it's something that Amanda has had to do, and has had to do to have the safety of her own children. Things that I do, as I said, I'm the provider of respite. I'm the holiday organiser, homework helper, taxi driver, netball cheerleader, career advisor, and relationship counsellor now. During lockdown, one of the things that happened when the kids couldn't go to school, that was very overwhelming for Amanda. She was really worried about how they were going to cope with their schoolwork. So each morning, I would pick the girls up in the morning and drive them they would come to my place. We would they would come in, they would set themselves up at my table here, and in the other room, I would set myself up to teach social work at the university. And so we were all teaching online from different rooms, and then they would have dinner with me and I'd take them home. We did that for 2.5 months. But it's what we did as a family, and it worked. I think what's been really important is to provide the kids with I've been very sort of committed to providing the kids with a rich upbringing to break the cycle. So, getting in early intervention. The girls had great early childhood teachers. They were slow to talk. They had twin talk. So, we got onto that very early because we didn't want the kids just being sort of labelled as, oh, they've got disabilities because their mother's got disabilities. They didn't have disabilities. They don't have disabilities. So we wanted to be on top of that. We talked to the school about our family. So when we went for interviews, we go as our family. The girls refer to this, we're a family. We don't live in the same house, but we are a family. They talk about my family as their extended family. Provided the girls with lots of opportunities in terms of their very sporty cultural experiences and travel. So we've been able to do that because I've had some social capital behind me. I've been able to share that with them, which a lot of families who are at risk don't have. They don't have that social capital that comes with being networked and with people. So I think one of the things that's been really sort of important is, we don't talk about this in any sort of particular way. We actually sort of have just said this is what we do as a family. When the girls were, I'm very conscious of time, I won't go too much longer, but when the girls were very little, Amanda and I gave a talk at one of the ACID conferences and about the first 5 years, and the girls came to hear us practicing our presentation, and Amanda started crying. She was crying more out of joy about the girls, but they were sort of like taken aback by this. And Lily comes to me afterwards and says, "Why did you make Mummy cry?" And I said, "Oh, well, Mummy was just, she loves you very much, and that's why." And she goes, "And what's this disability?" And so that was the first time that we had to talk about disability. And so the way that I described it to them is I said, well, as a family, we all have different abilities. And that's what a disability is. Disability is a different ability. So your mum has different abilities to me, and you have different abilities to your sister, even though you're twins, you're both different. You have different abilities. So we talk about disability in terms of our different abilities rather than being as a deficit or I'm doing this because your mother can't. We talk about it that it's normal as families to support each other. That's what families do. So we don't see it as you're getting anything special. This is just what families do. Families actually support each other. And so in building up that circle of support around Amanda and the twins, there's been, of course, me. The girls refer to me as Mama because when they were little, they couldn't say Margaret. They used to say Ma. And so I became Mama. And they had my community that I'm part of. They had my family. They had the previous foster carer that Amanda stayed in contact with who had the baby when Amanda was young. Her family and their networks became supportive of Amanda and the twins. Amanda, through that connection, Amanda became involved in a church community, and they are still quite involved in that community. So Amanda and the twins have the support of that church community. Neighbours and friends that have been supportive. And the twins' mothers have, the twins have made friends with friends that have been, have been quite accepting of Amanda. So she's actually had those friends. So there's been, as you can see, there's a circle of support around them. And here I'll go over this. It's just a way of thinking about, family. We often think about the tasks of parenting, but really parenting is around how you negotiate things and how you organise it and how you organise your support network and how you organise your own, your partner's your relationship and how you get things happening. So what I see is that Mnuchin here, he refers to this as the Parenting Holland, which is a bit like, your management committee of your organisation. We're like a management committee, Amanda and I, and we have different people on, and we're all working together to co-parent these kids. And what's made it work? As I said, a lot of love and goodwill, communication, a lot of talking. It's something that, hasn't always been easy, but talking and communication has been really important. Respecting Amanda as the mother. I'm not the kid's mother. They refer to me as their godmother. I'm not their godmother, but they refer to me as their godmother. Sometimes their grandmother, depending on where we are. But Amanda's always their mother, and also I think one of the good things is we haven't had Amanda's been very good at making good choices about not having in terms of her relationships and in terms of who she'll have around her children. So that's been good. I think about so many parents, who have children, children with intellectual disabilities who then do become parents. And, I suppose I had a lot of background to know how to do this, but it's really been something I've done in the dark. I'm really committed now to supporting parents behind parents. I think often parents behind parents with parents behind young adults with intellectual disabilities get a really raw deal in terms of people working with them to understand what their concerns are. So I'm really, that's where my research interests are lying at the moment, is around this area of how do we support families behind those who are going to make a family. And here we have the girls, they're 16, and that's them, and they're beautiful. And they're the first in 3 generations to grow up not in state care, so we know that it is possible. And I think I'll finish there because I've gone over time.